This is Race, Reason, and Republic. We are joined by Joey Beretta from Washington and Lee University, Denny Casa from Oxford University, and Jason Stevens from Ashland University, speaking to us on everything from Milton and civic education to more American themes. First by Joey Beretta, the importance of African American political thought for the civic education movement. Welcome.
Hello there. Thank you, everybody, for coming. I will say I took the any stage development part very seriously. This is just an idea I've had that I'm hoping our discussion helps me build on. So the impetus for my presentation today is a little self-centered. Weird way to start, I know, but it's an interesting crossroads in marrying my own area of interest with the changes going on in higher education today. When I first began my foray into African American political thought, it was by happenstance. In college, I took 2 classes which led me down this path, Race and Equality and Frederick Douglass. I'm a Douglass scholar. The political science undergraduate program I attended was uniquely great in helping students discover the unique qualities of the American founding and to consider the core questions of the Western tradition of political philosophy, including by people like that guy, Jason Stevens. In other words, I was the beneficiary of a serious education which promoted serious conversation in the pursuit of truth that is in some ways like what these centers seek to provide. At the same time, my own area of concern was, like most modern students who are first learning about the American founding, I think, the place of slavery within a country that declares itself to be rooted in the principle of equality. I think there are many students who are like I was back then. They need to both be exposed to the principles and institutions of the founding, while also seeing how things were not always equally applied to African Americans, and how we were able to make changes in order to make our union more perfect. In the political thought of Frederick Douglass and some of his successors, there's a useful corpus for study that I think can help students understand how to reconcile the laudable features of the founding with some of the inequality present in American practice. Since the publication of the 1619 Project, going on 5 years ago now, there's been a concerted effort to teach students that the American regime was founded for the protection of slavery. A serious study of Douglass and other African-American thinkers could be just the answer that civic education centers, like the one hosting today, need in order to help bring in people who may be skeptical of their very existence. Douglass shows the different perspectives that one can have on the place of blacks at our nation's founding. He advocated 2 conceptions of the founding which were diametrically opposed. He's initially critical and believed that the Constitution was a pro-slavery document, irredeemable, akin with the Garrison model. He would later view the founding positively, advocating an anti-slavery view of the Constitution. This could lead one to conclude that he was inconsistent in his thought, although he did change his opinion. He reliably advocates for each view in his speeches and writings during these 2 distinct phases of his career. In 1851, his change of opinion announced, Douglass wrote, quote, "We found in our former position, when debating the question, we were compelled to go behind the letter of the Constitution and to seek its meaning in the history and practice of the nation under it, a process always attended with disadvantages," end quote. He thought that the method of divining original intent beyond the provisions of the text served to perpetuate the institution of slavery. A new focus on the meaning of the text directly would certainly be most advantageous for abolition, but it would also provide, he thought, a more accurate interpretation too. He had great reason to believe that the country which enabled his enslavement was founded upon slavery, but he used his own reading of the Constitution to reject such assertions. Students will arrive in our classrooms with political narratives in mind, and Douglass offers us a superior model for academic inquiry centered on intellectual humility and questioning the assumptions one brings to the question at hand through rational discourse. Beyond a positive reading of the Constitution, he believed that education was critical for attaining a basic state of equality between self-governing human beings and citizens. It would not be enough to have a good constitution, since a popular regime is ultimately defined by the character of its citizens. He emphasized the importance of inculcating necessary skills and the development of the mind to live a productive and meaningful life in society. His conception of education was both practical and philosophic. He viewed education as intrinsic good for the individual receiving it. It improved the mind and the character of the person being educated, and it could serve the practical role of raising one's status in society. He recognized that African Americans had been shaped for subservience under slavery, so they needed to be educated to overcome the ill effects of this perverse system. His proposals for Black elevation would begin with industrial training and proceed to encompass a deeper liberal education later in his work. In other words, Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois in one, so even better than both, arguably. Douglass thought of education, industrial and academic, as part of his comprehensive project to shape an America in which Black and white racial identities would be subservient to one's status as a human being and citizen. He thought Black people coming out of slavery needed to receive industrial training first to be able to work in more skilled occupations befitting a free person, instead of doing menial tasks easily performed by anyone. However, beyond the dignity attained through self-sufficiency, Douglass had a deeper understanding of education's effect on the human soul that we as educators need to always have in mind as we teach America's future civic leaders. Aristotle famously described the human being as a rational animal who lives in political society due to the capacity of logos that makes a person distinct from other animals. Douglass spoke on why one's rational capacity must be cultivated. Quote, "In his natural condition, however, man is only potentially great. As a mere physical being, he does not take high rank even among the beasts of the field. His true dignity is not to be sought in his arms or in his legs, but in his head." End quote. Man is not naturally physically stronger than the other animals. His potential to be great lie within the capacity of his mind, not the training of the body. He continues, quote, "But if man is without education, although with all his latent possibilities attaching to him, he is, as I said, but a pitiable object, a giant in body, but a pygmy in intellect, and at best, but half a man," end quote. Douglass knew what man could be like at his worst without the cultivation of these capacities because he witnessed it under slavery. The slave master and the enslaved person were both educated in the ways of the institution instead of the free inquiry that Douglass thought was best and natural for human beings. It placed the master into a position of a god and the enslaved person into that of a beast, neither fit for self-government without significant reform. For Douglass, the citizen required education in order to not be governed by base impulses instead of reason. He is to me the clear figure that our civic education future needs because he addresses both questions of citizenship and regime, but he also has a great understanding of human nature that he has arrived at by seeing human beings when they lived in ways not fitting for human beings. So just as we look to first principles, you could say Douglass looks at the beginning of entrance into political life as well in a more direct, concrete way. Booker T. Washington is another great African-American thinker who I have found is too easily dismissed by students that I've taught. He offers a unique perspective on advocating reform in adverse circumstances. Like Douglass, he was born on a plantation without knowledge of his exact date of birth, and he knew little of his ancestry other than the great tortures his mother's side faced in the Middle Passage. Washington possessed an inquisitive mind, and he strove to be educated at a time in which this was difficult. While the Hampton Institute he's attended was more of a trade school than a modern university, the things that he sought to learn are useful to consider as we approach civics. For example, he gave great praise to Hampton's founder, General Samuel Armstrong, saying that education comes from exposure to great men, not simply to reading great books. So kind of like what Greg was talking about yesterday. In other words, education needs to shape thought, but also character through witnessing good people conduct action well. As we look for leadership in our political order, as we seek to educate future civic leaders, Washington embodies self-making in an amazing way. Washington gave the famous Atlanta Exposition speech in 1895, the year that Douglass died, actually, and it represents his ascension to the leadership position for the interest of Black America. It would be criticized as a compromise by W.E.B. Du Bois. However, it reveals a useful insight into how he believed racial reconciliation could be attained. The famous exhortation to cast down your buckets where you are is often viewed as Washington placating whites. But I would instead posit that he is forward-looking, actually. He thought the conditions of the country could only change as members of both races lived together. Instead of fleeing for racially segregated areas, Washington thought Blacks could engage in meaningful work to elevate social standing, and he told whites to consider the role that Blacks had played as a key labor force that helped the country to grow. To be clear, he does in this speech say that social equality is not a question that could be taken up at the time, but through, quote, constant struggle rather than artificial forcing, end quote, the rights and privileges of citizenship may be equally extended to all Americans in practice, not simply on paper. In The American Negro and His Economic Value, Washington refers to the date of 1619, but instead of, like the project does, mentioning simply the legacy of slavery, he points out that the black population has adapted and multiplied, persevering while looking the white man in the face. For Washington, great progress had been attained through constant struggle by everybody on an individual level. I've heard Du Bois's famous declaration about how he walks with Shakespeare and when 'tis not, cited to support the great books by those on the right as a way to show connection between what they teach and the African American tradition. It's a good starting point, but I find that insufficient. While Du Bois may have been of the political left, and extremely so later in life, he teaches all sides important things to remember about the contributions of Black America that we would do well to remember. He argued there are no truer exponents of the principles of the Declaration than African Americans. He said that it was characteristic for Blacks to pursue liberty in their history, and the type of education he thought they should seek would build on this quality. In Of the Training of Black Men in the Souls of Black Folk, Du Bois decries the color prejudice of the South, acknowledging that its effects linger and cannot simply be overcome by an act of the legislature. He also described a need for a broadening of human reason and a universality of taste and culture. He notes that education is commonly viewed as the solution, but he questions what form it must take, positing that there needs to be a training to enable both races to live together peaceably. Specifically, he rejects Washington's emphasis on industrial training as the means for elevation. Instead, he thinks there must be a pull rather than a push, where quality education is offered to Blacks commensurate with whites. He viewed the Hampton Institute as academically in line with a typical high school rather than a serious university education. While one can dispute his claim that elevation simply needs to be a top-down approach led by the talented 10th, we can find something useful for this in all of our programs claiming to educate the next generation of civic leaders. One thing he strongly emphasizes is civic virtue. While he places it in terms of the oppressed Black population to be used as a means of racial elevation, he does say that Northerners treated their votes indifferently, and Blacks, because of the oppression that they had faced, learned to place value upon them. He wanted to promote a revival of civic virtue in which participating in the electoral process was taken as a responsibility to benefit one's race and improve one's country. And now for the last thinker I'll mention today, Martin Luther King Jr. He's perhaps the Black activist and thinker who most easily is adopted, specifically by those on the right related to the civic education movement, I think, because they cite his line from the I Have a Dream speech about judging him based on the content of his character rather than the color of his skin, and then they don't really go much further than that. Again, I say this is good, but there is more of his work that should be of interest to us. Take, for example, his understanding of Christianity in his book, Strength to Love, in which he addresses the need for Christians to live differently than people who are purely of the earth, of earthly concerns. He cites how there is a tendency in our culture for people to engage in mass conformity rather than live in accordance with belief or principle. This is present, he says, even among the clergy who stand behind the pulpit rather than choosing to benefit the community. To be clear, King does not say that nonconformity is inherently good because the end of the action matters. As we strive to teach the next generation of civic leaders who may have to express ideas that are heterodox among the country's elite, King provides a useful emphasis on how to maintain principle in a hostile environment. Now, of course, the I Have a Dream speech, I have to mention it because it makes a wonderful compliment to Douglas's efforts to promote his conception of the founding as inclusive of both races. As Justin Dyer mentioned yesterday, King has multiple allusions to the core documents of America, including the Declaration, Constitution, Gettysburg Address, and the Emancipation Proclamation. He famously opens with a line reminiscent of the Gettysburg Address. 50 years ago, he says, a great American in whose symbolic shadow we stand today signed the Emancipation Proclamation. From this point, King proceeds to explain how the century which followed did not fully live up to that hope for freedom that the Emancipation Proclamation gave. There were chains, he says, of segregation and discrimination that persisted. The famous line that the Constitution and Declaration constituted a promissory note to recognize the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, is a reminder that the American regime has a fundamentally good foundation, which has, when used, made possible the end of slavery and the incorporation of African Americans into the body politic. While King was critical of the conduct of white America, he maintained that his dream was deeply rooted in the American dream. As he proclaimed, quote, "I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal," end quote. From Douglass to King, we can see the good and the bad in the American story. They address the questions our students may have about how one can be so positive about the nation's founding and constitutional design when considering real injustice. Instead of shying away from conversations about the hard questions, we can have a more constructive dialogue when we have this corpus to look back on as a part of a well-rounded civic program. In the various centers, we have a solid foundation in the fields of political philosophy, American political thought, history, and a token economist or two if we let them in. It is my hope that we can expand the works we include in this renaissance of civic education, even beyond the issue of race. These Black thinkers have important observations on the character of the regime, human nature, and the purpose of education. In other words, they offer to us a civic education in and of themselves. Thank you, and I look forward to the Q&A.
Hi, thank you for having me. Today, I'll be speaking about John Milton and civic education from the perspective of a Renaissance scholar. And I want to pause and say that I think from a Renaissance studies perspective, that term, civic education, implies something of a tension. The civic institutions, the institutions of a commonwealth for Renaissance political theory, are often conceived as a framework for longevity and stability over time. On the other hand, a humanist education aims to cultivate the kind of judgment that normally operates within civic institutions, but can also transcend or renovate or adapt those institutions in a crisis, of which there were many, of course, during the Renaissance. If legitimate authority breaks down, for example, during a civil war, citizens are compelled to use their judgment without the reassuring appeal to legitimate authority. Now, John Milton spent most of his life working out precisely this question. He saw most institutions, both civic and religious, break down during the English Civil Wars. Taking the side of the Puritans in that conflict, he saw his side gain power at first and attempt to build a republic, only to lose it all with the return of monarchy. Political disruption was compounded by religious breakdown and personal disappointment for him. A deeply heterodox Protestant who rejected key dogmas such as the Trinity, Milton sought to convince fellow Puritans to accept a more expansive vision of the church and was unsuccessful in that effort as well. So despite being intensely interested in civic and religious reformation, it's not surprising perhaps, given this context, that Milton did not stipulate many detailed fixed institutions to govern society, and those he did propose were tactical and context dependent. Instead, what he is, in my opinion, very interesting in providing was a model of education that aimed to cultivate decision-making. Such education trains citizens how to adapt their institutions to the historically emergent needs of the Republic and of the Reformation. Paradise Lost outlines how this works in poetry. But today, I will focus on both the poem and his prose treatises on education, bringing them together as part of a coherent vision of interpretive decision-making and how to educate that. I'll argue that his theory of education offers a humanist way to think about political judgment, reform, and even judgment is understood in new and interesting directions that I'll conclude with. I'll also try to offer some thoughts inspired by the panels we've heard on what this might mean for a great book's application of these ideas. And finally, point to some future research where I think Milton studies would do well to bring this theory of education forward. Now, Milton thought that education should train a citizen's capacity for judgment in the political sphere and the church. A good teacher should familiarize students with a canonical text, for him this was the Bible and some of the classics, and then confront students with uncertainty on how to apply that text to an unforeseen situation. Students learn judgment within the institutional framework of a humanist school, but the aim is to extend it into the active life as citizens and as Christians. So such an interpretive community of such students is unified by a hermeneutic process that Milton calls charity, by which he means a willingness to openly debate others who are interpreting in the same way. There are obvious risks here, and Paradise Lost is, among other things, a warning of what can go wrong. I read that poem as an educational poem, inspired by educational theory, that the fall is an illustration of what can go wrong. And nevertheless, this ideal is at the heart of Milton's work. I'll start with Of Education, a treatise where he explains his method in I think, the clearest way throughout his prose. He sets out to imagine an elite academy for aristocratic Puritan youth, teaching them civic virtue and a range of practical arts from farming to warfare to swordsmanship. But the ultimate goal is, again, to cultivate interpretive decision-making in the leaders and active participants of a commonwealth. Milton adopts the Greek term proairesis and defines it as the judgment of good and evil. And I'll use the slide here and keep returning to it. So I'll return to the slide and spend some time reading it carefully. So if you could follow me here. By this time, years and good general precepts will have furnished them more distinctly with that act of reason which in ethics is called proairesis, that they may with some judgment contemplate upon moral good and evil. Then will be required a special reinforcement of constant and sound indoctrinating to set them right and firm, instructing them more amply in the knowledge of virtue and the hatred of vice, while their young and pliant affections are led through all the moral works of Plato, Xenophon, Cicero, Plutarch, Laertius, and those Locrian remnants, but still to be reduced in their nightward studies, wherewith they close the day's work, under the determinate sentence of David or Solomon, or the Evangelists and Apostolic Scriptures. The training proceeds in 3 steps. Students are first indoctrinated in the knowledge of virtue. Then they are exposed to pre-Christian moral works, which have the capacity to tempt as well as instruct. And then they are reduced each night to the determinate sentence of Scripture. In the middle step of this process, the student judges pre-Christian texts about which there could be some interpretive debate, using their proairesis rather than only a prescriptive moral norm. The teacher guides the student, but also tests him. Hence the need for a return back to Scripture, the determinate sentence to which all uncertainties are then reduced in a regular way. But the key point is that students are asked and encouraged to make a judgment, and trained to do this repeatedly. Milton's political prose returns time and time again to this basic model in different spheres. I could give examples from The Doctrine and Discipline of Divorce, where he argues that the right of divorce is part of the decision-making that should belong to good men. When that is legitimate or not is context-specific. More examples could be drawn from the political treatises of the late 1640s and 1650s, when the decision-making power is then, in that case, revolves around determining who is a tyrant. Right? So that, too, is a definition of which there can't be a prescriptive rule, but rather a set of interpretive frameworks about how to decide who a tyrant is. In these moments, Milton is concerned to understand how the community can respond to moments of revolutionary institutional change without betraying the principles that animated in the first place. The clearest examples are perhaps we can bring in the Areopagitica, where Milton argues that heretical texts and other controversial texts should be allowed to circulate so as to test virtuous men, allowing them to decide whether books are eventually worthy of censorship. So it's not, as is sometimes understood, a pure freedom of speech argument. It's an interpretive training argument. Like, we want this to test our citizenry so that we censor them after, together. if needed. At a moment when London was threatened with a siege, he imagines the important battles to be largely interpretive ones. He imagines there be pens and heads there, sitting by their studios' lamps, musing, searching, revolving new notions and ideas wherewith to present, as with their homage and their fealty, the approaching Reformation. Others as fast reading, trying all things, assenting to the force of reason and convincement. This is poetry and fiction, but he's imagining a community that embodies these interpretive principles and the charity to allow them to flourish. The whole nation here is envisioned as an intellectual elite who have been trained through frequent trial to judge how to adapt to the unforeseen circumstances of this war and the ideological tension of that war. Politics is important for Milton, but the most important, I would argue, application for this education theory is power within the church. The religious side of the argument is clearest in his deeply unorthodox Christian doctrine, where he defends a series of heretical views, including anti-Trinitarianism. The treatise was too radical to be published, abandoned at one point and found much later. But in the preface, Milton speaks about an ideal community of like-minded men that is not too far from that passage in the Arpeggitica. I address myself with much more confidence to learned than to untutored readers. Or, if the very learned are not always the best judges and critics of such matters, at any rate to mature, strong-minded men who thoroughly understand the teaching of the gospel. Most authors who have dealt with this subject at the greatest length in the past have been in the habit of filling their pages almost entirely with expositions of their own ideas. They have relegated to the margin, with brief reference to chapter and verse, the scriptural text upon which all they teach is utterly dependent. I, on the other hand, have striven to cram my pages even to overflowing, with quotations drawn from all parts of the Bible, and to leave as little space as possible for my own words. Now, some of this is standard argumentation for this kind of treatise, but in the context with everything else Milton writes everywhere else about how interpretation should work, I think we have here an example of how proairesis works in religious debate. He's saying, this is what I think, here are my sources, judge, and come to your own decision. The imagined readership implicit is educated, not only in the technical sense that they can read the original language of the Bible, but also in the deeper moral sense that they can come to an interpretive decision that is creative and adapted to this unforeseen situation of reform in the church. Now, the key argument authorizing this interpretive community is that God wants to be known in this way, that there's an imperative. The divine intentionality appears in Paradise Lost, actually, so I'll spend some time on the poem. In Book 3, God the Father predicts the fall of Adam and Eve and stipulates that the punishment must be death for them. Die he or justice must, in a memorable phrase. But this pronouncement turns out to be a test designed to give the Son of God sufficient interpretive space to apply what that might mean and to adjudicate between that statement and other parts of God's speech that seem more generous or graceful, and to therefore develop what is the interpretive core of what we are hearing. Echoing Abraham's bargain for Sodom and Gomorrah, the Son responds, O Father, gracious was that word which closed thy sovereign sentence that man should find grace. For should that man finally be lost, should man, thy creature late so loved, thy youngest son fall circumvented thus by fraud, though joined with his own folly, that be from thee far, that far be from thee, Father, who art judge of all things made, and judgest only right. So, in this poem, and in Milton's theology, the Son of God has less than perfect knowledge. So this is an interpretation. There's no mind-reading superpowers where he's just sort of completing the words. This is an interpretation of what he has heard. It is risky and creative. The method is similar to what we've seen in Of Education. Calling Adam the youngest son is interesting because, of course, the speaker is the firstborn son. He is saying, effectively, I know what being a son in general means, through a history of relationships that we have. So here is what you must mean in this unprecedented situation. Like all uses of proairesis, the statement comes within a hair's breadth of rebellion. And I think if this were a play about mere human beings, such as King Lear, for example, another instance of dividing the kingdom, giving over to the next generation, this would be a tragedy. The potential for misunderstanding among human beings is great. But Milton's God is a perfect, omnipotent pedagogue, the perfect pedagogue. And he wants to be known through proairesis and interpretive charity. That charity gives his pupils, the son in this case, the confidence to interpret as boldly as he does, as long as it is in good faith and respectful to the text of what God has just said. Now, by focusing on interpretation, Milton gives us a Christianity that is deeply unfamiliar. The crucifixion, for instance, becomes, the actual event of the crucifixion, becomes an afterthought to the interpretive leap of imagining what the crucifixion is. The important battle is the interpretation of what it might be. On me let death wreak all his rage. Under his gloomy power I shall not long lie vanquished. Thou hast given me to possess life in myself forever. By thee I live, though now to death I yield and am his due. The Son could lie vanquished for all he knows. But that would not reflect what he knows and has interpreted through a habit of education, what it is that the Father has promised him, which is life in myself forever. So he's applying that promise to the unforeseen situation of death, that he will offer himself to die. So he develops a vision of the resurrection by yoking together two contradictory ideas, by thee I live and to death I yield. The present tense tells us that the Son is not just describing what will happen. This is a speech act. It is happening here. It is being actualized, and the actual crucifixion becomes a proof that he means what he said. I say this to highlight that the model of interpretive decision-making established by the Son in Paradise Lost is a pedagogical example to all other creatures for Milton, extending across religious and political spheres. So this is a paradigm. It is also the culmination of what Milton argued human beings should do in history. The later books of Paradise Lost claim that the faithful are sometimes reduced to one just man, nominally people like Abraham and Moses, but also obviously how Milton saw himself in defeat. The ambition expressed in all his writing was not to remain a virtuous minority of one just man, but to grow through a discipline of civic education inspired and based on the interpretive practice of the Son of God. And there's more I could say here about the fall as well. I will briefly touch on that. But before I do so, I want to just highlight the key point, which is that Milton maintains a tension between education and the institutions of the Commonwealth. Key institutions such as humanist schools and reformed churches train up good men, but pupils, in his vision, do not simply reproduce what they learn. They adapt, renovate, update their republic, the discipline of their church, to the situation. This approach is revolutionary, but it also opens the door, one could argue, to arbitrary rule and antinomianism, of which Milton has been credibly accused. And I think I would argue that the fall is an acknowledgement of this. One of the reasons that the fall is so compelling and believable is that the interpretive tests that animate Paradise Lost everywhere set up the temptation by Satan as something that could be a arguably believable way to gain knowledge. So there's more I could say about what that means, the fruit as an abstracted version of this interpersonal academy. So it is a corruption of that ideal. But these Adam and Eve are primed to be interpreting in ways that are very, very close to outright rebellion. So that is an acknowledgement by Milton of the seriousness and danger of what he is proposing. It also makes Milton sound dated. What I mean by that is that critical reception has argued that Milton's dated because modern political and economic thought is, after all, devoted to developing institutions that achieve their aim, especially when individuals are not so virtuous. Right? The separation of powers in government, proposed in Milton's time by James Harrington, aims not to educate judgment or virtue so much as to reduce the concentration of power that allows acting on vice and on bad judgment. A similar focus could be argued emerges a few decades later in economic thought. The invisible hand of the market, still invoked by modern economics to explain how apparently selfish decisions contribute to the common good, is part of that. As long as there is a separation between economic and political power that promotes competition, the selfish interests of lenders and borrowers can come together in a market and generate economic growth that is beneficial. So Milton's ideas are outdated in that sense, in the emphasis he puts on cultivating habits of decision-making. but they emerge. I think their value becomes clear when we remember that his ideas came in the context of a civil war, when key institutions were not functioning. It is in that emergency context that the value of shared texts, shared protocols for interpreting them becomes really clear. Today, I think a civics or a great books program may attempt something similar by training judgment by canonical texts. We've heard panels on virtues, patriotism, how they might apply. In an emergency situation, the definition of those words is precisely what's being contested, right? What is the patria in a civil war? And what Milton would say is that's exactly right. So we determine that through an interpretive method and a shared protocol so that we can have this, we can develop, as he tried to do in the church, the path towards defining what the Trinity means, for example. An exciting direction, I think, for further research, and this is really far out of this, is to link these arguments about decision-making with crises such as sovereign debt crises. I've been thinking about that a lot in my thinking, because a lot of economic historians are thinking about institutions as an important part of economic resilience after events such as the Greek debt crisis or the 1997 Asian financial crisis and other macro crises that we've been also talking about in other panels. And a lot of the literature talks about culture and institutions, but as I trained as a Renaissance scholar thinking about them, that literature is actually also talking about the pre-institutional habits of decision-making that are prevalent in some cultures that allow some to come back from that and reunify under a new social contract, and others that become serial defaulters. So I think that would be an interesting application for how institutions emerge. And the language of Milton gives us a way to think about the pre-institutional way of coming to a decision. So I'll leave it there. But what I want to say is that Milton, in his responsiveness to the emergency situation of a civil war, offers education. And the kind of education is what unifies both the prose, the poetry, and its applicability today. Thank you.
All right, thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you to the Salmon Chase Center for organizing this conference. It's a pleasure to be here. The title of my paper and my presentation is Abraham Lincoln, Stephen Douglas, and the Galesburg Challenge. And if you don't know what the Galesburg Challenge is, well, that's what I'm here to talk about today. Much has been written about Abraham Lincoln's famous Freeport question at the 1858 joint debates with Stephen A. Douglas. Less recognized is what we might call Lincoln's Galesburg Challenge, which Lincoln presented to Douglas at the 5th debate in Galesburg, Illinois. In the midst of an argument regarding the morality of slavery and the nature of democracy in America, Douglas contended that the nation was founded on the principle of white supremacy, and that when the founders said all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence, they meant only white men. Lincoln, on the other hand, affirmed that based on all available historical evidence, Americans should rest assured that the founders intended to include all human beings and all races in the Declaration's equality principle. To demonstrate his confidence in this belief, Lincoln challenged Douglas to provide primary source evidence that anyone prior to the 1850s ever said that the black race was not included in the Declaration. Here is the crux of the challenge as stated by Lincoln at the Galesburg debate in October 1858. So if you're wondering what the Galesburg Challenge is, this is it from Lincoln. Quote, "I believe the entire records of the world from the date of the Declaration of Independence up to within 3 years ago may be searched in vain for one single affirmation from one single man that the Negro was not included in the Declaration of Independence. I think I may defy Judge Douglas to show that he ever said so, that Washington ever said so, that any president ever said so, that any member of Congress ever said so, or that any living man upon the whole earth ever said so, until the necessities of the present policy of the Democratic Party in regard to slavery had to invent that affirmation, end quote. The Galesburg Challenge was about correcting a very narrow yet tremendously important injustice, the lie that Douglass and others were spreading that insisted the founders never intended to include the black race in the Declaration. Douglass was the one asserting that the Declaration only applied to white men, and so the burden of proof fell on him. Lincoln, in issuing the Galesburg Challenge, called for that proof, believing all along that such evidence did not exist. In this presentation, I argue that the Galesburg Challenge mattered in 1858, and it still matters today. Lincoln's challenge and Douglass's subsequent inability or refusal to answer it reveals an important lesson about the uses and abuses of historical texts. During a time when leaders such as Douglass attempted to rewrite history to score political points, Lincoln insisted on accurately reading and interpreting primary documents. Studying this aspect of the Lincoln-Douglas debates highlights the importance of the original meaning of the Declaration, especially the principle that all men are created equal, as well as how Lincoln thought about that principle, particularly in contrast to political rivals like Douglass and Roger Taney. Okay, so now let's go to the debates themselves. Among the several crucial topics discussed during the 1858 Senate campaign, including the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision, and the House divided speech, arguably the most important issue was the meaning of the Declaration. Lincoln and Douglass spent more time during the debates arguing over the correct interpretation of the Declaration than any other subject. One cannot read the Lincoln-Douglas debates with care and escape the obvious conclusion that our current arguments over the meaning of the Declaration, particularly the phrase, all men are created equal, are nothing new. The debate that divides Americans today in the 21st century over the original meaning of our nation's founding charter is identical to the argument that Lincoln and Douglass were having in the 1850s. When the founders said all men in the Declaration, did they mean all human beings, or did they mean only white men? Listen to Douglass describe how the nation was founded, according to him, on white supremacy. Quote, "I believe this government was made on the white basis. I believe it was made by white men for the benefit of white men and their posterity forever." End quote. Douglass's interpretation of the Declaration, as applying only to white men, corresponds with how many modern readers, especially students, interpret the American founding today. I suspect these readers are largely unaware that this interpretation of the Declaration has its origins in the political thought not only of Stephen Douglas, but of the author of the infamous 1857 Dred Scott Supreme Court decision, Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. While Douglass and Taney argued that the founders had a more restrictive interpretation of equality that only included white men, Lincoln advocated a reading of all men that actually meant all men, i.e., all humankind. The Galesburg Challenge was Lincoln's attempt to prove that his reading of the Declaration was right and that Douglass's and Taney's interpretation was wrong. Now, Lincoln was a great teacher of American history. It was in the political struggle of the 1850s, above all in the debates with Douglass, that Lincoln's understanding of history was called forth. No one who has studied the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and additionally Lincoln's 1854 Peoria speech and his 1860 Cooper Union address, can possibly doubt that Lincoln took the study of America and the founding era in particular extremely seriously. No high school textbook has presented the facts of the history of slavery in America so assiduously as Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln demonstrated that teaching with primary documents remains the best instruction in American history available to teachers, students, and citizens. The Galesburg Challenge reflects the importance that Lincoln placed on the study of such text. The use of original sources provides essential evidence necessary to corroborate or repudiate historical claims. In addition, an education that includes primary historical documents offers a solution to the problem that Lincoln first raised in his 1838 Lyceum address about the fading memories of the American Revolution. Although the living history of the founding generation was quickly disappearing from the face of the earth, primary documents allow one to connect the living and the dead. In a way, these documents facilitate a conversation with dead people from forgotten times. Lincoln had a habit of issuing public challenges when the truth of the historical record was in dispute. Most of the time, these disputes involved Stephen A. Douglas. These various challenges were more than rhetorical flourishes unleashed by a skilled lawyer and politician. They represented a calculated response to what Lincoln viewed as an unconscionable crime committed against history and the truth. Lincoln would throw down the proverbial gauntlet in those cases when the present threatened to destroy the past. Douglas misreading the Declaration as a white supremacist document was for Lincoln a threat to honest interpretation of that document as a charter for future American freedoms as the founders intended it to be. To rescue the past from being destroyed by the present, Lincoln turned to the primary documents. Lincoln's focus on primary source evidence for understanding and teaching American history was evident in the Galesburg Challenge. Lincoln reminded the American people of the importance of studying history through the lens of original sources, as opposed to relying exclusively on secondary interpretive accounts by biased sources such as Douglas. The Galesburg Challenge was an invitation to self-education, with the great minds of the past as teachers in the service of protecting self-government in the stormy present and indeterminable future. Lincoln turned to the documents, and more importantly, the principles contained in those documents, to guide a divided nation. Today, if we are still willing to take his challenge seriously, maybe he can do so again. Now, I want to take a look at the challenge in some greater detail. While Lincoln did not frame his challenge in the form of a question, it is helpful to recognize that there is a question at the heart of Lincoln's rhetoric. Lincoln, of course, was a lawyer who knew never to ask a question if one does not already know the answer. At the core of the Galesburg Challenge, Lincoln was asking, did anyone prior to the 1850s ever affirm that the Declaration of Independence did not include the black race? Now, there was both a low and a high purpose involved in what Lincoln was trying to do when he issued the Galesburg Challenge. The low purpose was strictly political. Lincoln obviously cared about the outcome of the senatorial contest and his own reputation and future political prospects. But there was also a higher purpose involved than just politics in issuing the Galesburg Challenge, because Lincoln also cared deeply about the truth, especially the principles of the Declaration. The higher purpose of the Galesburg Challenge was to arrest the spread and nationalization of slavery, which Lincoln saw as the outcome of Douglas's popular sovereignty doctrine, and to counter the twisting of the true meaning of the Declaration's equality principle. Douglas robbed the Declaration of its noblest truth when he claimed that it only applied to white people. Lincoln, in issuing the Galesburg Challenge, invited the nation to confront its past and probe the historical record, particularly the primary documents left behind, to return to an older understanding of the Declaration established by the founders. The Galesburg Challenge, therefore, was perhaps more of an invitation than it was a proper challenge. It was an invitation to the people to become self-educated about their own history in order to begin a necessary self-correction for returning to the path set out by the founders. The Galesburg Challenge was expressed as a personal belief of Lincoln's. He did not state the challenge as naked fact, but only as his firm belief. Hear Lincoln again. I'll restate the challenge briefly. Quote, I believe the entire records of the world, from the date of the Declaration up to within 3 years ago, may be searched in vain for one single affirmation from one single man that the Negro was not included in the Declaration, end quote. This is a difficult, if not impossible, historical claim. Absolutely no one prior to the 1850s said that the black race was not included in the Declaration. How could Lincoln or anyone else possibly know that for sure? Furthermore, how could such a claim be verified? Lincoln therefore softened his challenge with the use of qualifying phrases like, "I believe," and "I think." Also, was Lincoln perhaps exaggerating when he issued the Galesburg Challenge? Others have observed in Lincoln's defense that at times he exercised the politician's privilege of overstating his case. And while the historical record certainly contains conflicting and convoluted sources, there is nonetheless overwhelming support for Lincoln's position. Both Harry V. Jaffa and Alan Guelzo, for example, have demonstrated that the belief at the heart of Lincoln's Galesburg Challenge was essentially accurate, that the founders did intend to include the black race in the Declaration's equality principle, and that no one until the 1850s claimed otherwise. Furthermore, Douglas and Taney's interpretation of the Declaration is not to be confused with that of John C. Calhoun and his followers. The Calhounians had been around for a relatively long time by 1858, but they did not acknowledge any truth in the assertion that all men are created equal. As a result, they renounced both the founders and the Declaration as wrong in principle, socially, morally, and politically. There was plenty of primary source evidence out there that expressed Calhoun's perspective on the meaning of the Declaration. But this was not the point of the Galesburg Challenge. The Galesburg Challenge had to do with the views of Douglas, Taney, and an increasing number of Democrats who read into the Declaration a new meaning by reading the black race out of it. By the way, Lincoln provides that clarification between the Taney and Douglas school of thought on one hand and the Calhounians on the other hand. He makes that clarification when he restates the Galesburg Challenge later on in the debates at the seventh and final debate at Alton. Douglas was, of course, perfectly free to say whatever he wanted about the historical record. Lincoln, however, had a larger concern. As he put it in his 1860 Cooper Union speech, quote, "Douglas has no right to mislead others who have less access to history and less leisure to study it, thus substituting falsehood and deception for truthful evidence and fair argument," end quote. Douglas was not just slandering the founding fathers. He was taking deliberate political advantage of the historical ignorance of the public who simply did not know any better. Through no fault of their own, lacking the luxury of Douglas's educational advantages and opportunities, many in the American public allowed themselves to be duped by a clever lie masquerading as history. The public trusted Douglas as a teacher of the American story, and he led them astray with a corrupt version that was not true. Today, just like during Lincoln's time, too many people, especially I think young people, fail to take into account the primary sources, allowing themselves to be persuaded easily into the belief that the black race had no part to play in the promises of the Declaration. The problem, it seems to me, is that Taney and Douglas's interpretation of the Declaration is the version that many American students today are taught at school. They learn early on that the Declaration does not include all men, and thus students bring to the primary sources a tendency to see the inevitability of slavery and racism within the founding documents. The difference between 1858 and today is that we lack the leadership of a teacher like Abraham Lincoln to guide us back to the truth. Or do we? Through the primary documents, Lincoln still speaks today. Lincoln was a self-made master of words, and the Lincoln-Douglas debates mattered because, as Lincoln knew, words mattered. Words will always matter, and so will the beliefs and the ideas that words illuminate, especially these words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. The great debaters have passed into history, but the great debate goes on. Thank you.
We now have about 5 minutes, 6 minutes for questions. I'm going to come around with this mic starting over here, and please keep your questions as concise as possible.
Thank you very much. My question's for Joey. I'm interested in what you said about Booker T. Washington and how his teacher at Hampton was an education in himself. And I'm wondering if you think our civic education focuses maybe too much on ideas and not enough on, so to speak, introducing our students to the great men of history, such as like the way Plutarch might do it.
Oh, yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think of Plutarch in that situation, but yeah, I think this is on, right? Okay. Washington makes clear that witnessing great men and considering serious ideas need to go hand in hand. Now, I will say, I think Washington's a little too critical of the great books. And I always put him in the context of, he's saying Black Americans are so focused on wanting to read Greek and Latin at a time in which they've been relegated to a lower status in society, that what they really need is some sort of motivation to great action, to individual, perseverance. So I guess I think, yeah, you're right. I think today we're so focused in the realm of ideas that we need what Jason was talking about, primary education of the greatest thinkers in the tradition, combined with what Greg said yesterday, very well actually, about how the teachers, like General Armstrong, need to themselves be a model unto the students which they teach. We need to take more seriously that, yes, we teach them ideas in books, but we also are helping to cultivate the passions, the interest, and the character of the young people. So I would say that, yeah, Washington gives us both, like, a call to action as educators. We need to read what you're saying with Plutarch, but yeah, so it's a both and, I would say, if that makes sense.
Thanks. I'll try to be brief. This question's for Denny. Fantastic panel, fantastic paper. So in your interpretation of Milton, you talk times about multiple points about there being a shared interpretive community with a set hermeneutic. You have this indoctrination in virtue as the point of departure prior to this stage of prohairesis, and then this return back to scripture for resolution. So I have a question about the general uptake of Milton's method today. Is this a method that is particularly useful for religious communities? If so, it seems still quite valuable, but do you think that there's room for uptake beyond a religious community that's committed to a sort of shared hermeneutic, a shared text, but might be more broadly applicable for a more pluralistic kind of context?
Very good question. What is to be done and who is doing it? I think ultimately in education in the humanities, this is my view now. I'm not describing what is going on. I'm describing what I think should be the case. An education in the humanities is always, on some degree, a value judgment about texts that are very informative and valuable and influential. And so putting those texts in a curriculum and studying them together and asking for interpretation of those texts is, at the core, what Milton is doing. So the question is, one big difference that his argument has from ours is that he had widespread consensus on the Bible as the foundation. I think that is the greatest challenge today, and I think that's behind a lot of the panels as well here. It's like, what does civics mean, and what's its relationship to theology? We had that discussion this morning. I think that question is going to be worked out. It hasn't been worked out yet, but for Milton, he could rely on the national community accepting the Bible as the core text, and then his challenge was to expand an interpretation of the classics as part of that, as the tempting ground, because that was a live debate. Like there was no obvious reason why we should read any Plato, right? But we should read the Bible. So I think the way that he did it was to draw on a lot of arguments that are relevant today, to say that, well, you should read Plato because if you have a foundation in the Bible, studying Plato helps you develop your judgment. So the argument today would be outline the foundation and then range into potentially tempting works to exercise your judgment. I think that sounds like a good outline for the humanities broadly, and the Great Books course in particular.
Thank you. And I guess we're just going down the line. So I have a question for Professor Stevens, which is, so in your argument, you made the point, the point that the founders intended to include blacks as well as whites. And I guess my question is, I'm not like whether that's correct or not. Why does it matter as much as they intended to include blacks versus the fact that they recognized for example, even ex post that included, like, for example, black slaves. Like, I'm thinking of, like, for example, Jefferson's chapter on manners, where he says that, like, he trembles when he thinks of God's justice, right? And so, for example, if they're just intending to, like, protect even the white, like the white Americans, but they realize afterwards, oh wait, this also captures. Why do we need their original intent rather than how they actually understood the fact that it captures it even ex post? Why does their intent specifically matter?
Yeah, that's really good. I think I understand your question correctly. Right, so two quick points. One regarding, right, the assertion of the principle and the follow-up to it. Right, as Lincoln will observe in some of his speeches, if you're looking at just the follow-up, like what laws were passed during the founding in order to protect human equality, they did it even immediately place all white people on an equal basis, right? So like what they're actually able to do and accomplish is not a good indicator of what they originally believe. And why does what they originally believe matter? Because that has implications for understanding, well, what were the sources, what was the nation founded upon? What principle was the nation founded upon? Because if it was founded upon, as Douglas asserted, white supremacy, then you have an ugly founding. And as others have observed, it's hard to love an ugly founding. Whereas if the original intent is, right, to assert, to declare the equality of all mankind, and then to allow circumstances as fast as practicable to catch up to that belief and try to raise the nation to that standard, that means that the nation isn't founded on the principle of white supremacy. It's not founded on the principle of slavery, as the Southern Confederacy was founded upon, but that it was founded upon the principle of freedom and liberty to all. That distinction between liberty to all and slavery, that matters for Lincoln. That should matter to every citizen.
This is our last question.
I have a question about Milton. I wonder if you can talk about what do you do with the problem of Milton's elitism? Or in education, I think it looks like elitism. I mean, like a sense that there are some students you can't do anything with, or perhaps most students you can't do anything with. Like education is something that you can give to people who effectively already have it. More generally, it's the problem of election. I think, I mean, especially early in his career, Milton divides the world into an elect and then other people who probably can't be redeemed. I mean, like the universe in Comus is organized like this.
Very good question. I published a book on Renaissance literature with 2 chapters on Milton, and the second one is exactly on this. So I won't go over but Milton's elitism is something that I completely accept. I don't think it is an antinomian spiritually elect elitism. I think it is a cultural capital and learning elitism. And that's because of how he defines grace as he goes on in life. Grace is something that is widely offered and then cooperated with by those who are virtuous. And to cultivate that in practice, seemingly every example offered of cooperating with grace is an intellectually trained, humanist, interpretive example, which means that to fully cooperate, you must have this kind of course in education. I think he is absolutely an elitist who believes that the cultural capital of humanists like himself make them more apt to lead and to judge a republic, the republic's needs in an emergency. This is in part a feature of his time. It's not everything I'm not suggesting that everything in Milton is applicable in an uncritical way. The economic situation of Milton's time meant that most people couldn't read, right? And those who couldn't read well, and certainly not to the level that he demands. So there you could take, there's 2 things I would say. One is using his interpretive method means that you adapt his principles to the situation. And if the interpretive situation today is one that has a lot more literate people and a lot more surplus resources to distribute through education, a more broad education, then you adapt that system. You don't apply it uncritically. The second answer would be to say that, within Milton, there seems to be some suggestion of that. So in his late treatises, when he's talking about the return of the king and how you can prevent that, he imagines education being brought up, schools being built in every province to broaden that out into the nation. So he is an elitist, but he thinks that the elite group can expand. over time through education as education expands. What he does not want to do, and I think this is valuable, is remove that elitism by removing education from its role in judgment.
Please join me in thanking our panelists.